Before dawn, the water is the quietest thing in the world. A flat line, a low tide, and a long boat that rides so light it barely leaves a mark. The men say little because silence is a tool, but the real reason for quiet is the clock. What matters here is not a feeling of daring. It is a schedule that begins and ends with the sea. The word at the center of this, Viking, is not a job title in a royal list. It comes from the Old Norse vik, a bay or creek, and in its narrow use, it means a person who haunts those inlets. That detail reveals a habit more than an identity. In other words, this is about people who know the small places on the coast and use them. A vik is a hiding place and a runway. Writing grew out of that geography. The broader usage of Viking came later, and it stretches to cover a whole age. We say Viking Age is shorthand for a wide piece of Scandinavian history. That helps in conversation, but it blurs tasks together. In practice, very few people lived a permanent life of seaborne violence. Most men and women were rooted to land and kin. For this episode, we keep the term narrow, because the narrow sense keeps us close to the specific problems a raider solved in a single day. Those problems were not all military. They were practical. Most crews were drawn from communities of farmers and traders. Leaders were often active landholders who could equip a ship and call men. That helps explain the tone of a typical raid. It runs like a tight errand with a hard exit. Even elements of elite leisure, like hawking, appear in later storytelling about leaders to mark status. The point is not the falcon, but the social world it signals. Property, followers, obligations, and the means to gather them for a voyage. If we want to understand a day's raid with any confidence, we need to be clear about sources. For a long time, most of what the outside world thought it knew came from medieval Latin chroniclers. They wrote in monasteries that had reasons to remember fire and loss. Their accounts matter, but they have limits. They emphasize the shock that landed on them. The last 50 years or so have changed the picture because Scandinavian literature is no longer a sealed book to scholars. That change opens new angles on the same events. There are three main groups of native sources. First, the prose sagas and the Historia Danica of Saxo Grammaticus. These stand later than the Viking Age, but they preserve material that reaches back. Second, the older Eddaic poems, which come from the period itself. They tell us about religion, heroic stories, and a way of looking at life in those communities. Third, and most crucial for specific events, skaldic poetry. Skalds were court poets. They composed verses in praise of leaders, often at the time and place of the deeds. Skaldic stanzas are dense, but they carry names, places, and acts that can often be fixed in time. They are valuable because they functioned like receipts for reputation. If a verse says a ship ran up a river and took a bell or a banner, that claim mattered to the men who heard it then. The poetry is stylized, yet it ties brave words to concrete moves. That helps us reconstruct the bones of a day, even when prose stories add color later. This matters for our method. We will use skaldic hints as anchors. We will treat the sagas and Saxo as later narrative frames, and we will be cautious about the Latin chronicler's vantage point. That blend respects what each source does best and keeps us honest about the gaps. When direct words fail, we will turn to what the coast itself can tell us, including what a shallow draft boat can do in a creek. How tides set the clock, and why weight on a beach is riskier than the same weight inside a hull. So let us set the constraints of the day. Daylight offers a window that can be widened by early summer, but never ignored. Wind shapes speed and angle long before any shore comes into view. Tides turn creeks into gates that open and shut, and a sandbar at the mouth of a vik can be a welcome shield on the way in and a trap on the way out. Crew fatigue is a real thing because the oar is not a decoration. The exit has to be planned before the landing begins. The important point is that every choice ashore depends on the time left to reverse it. From the outside, Viking raid sounds like melee first and planning second. In practice, the reverse drove survival. Longships were tools designed for this routine. Their shallow draft let them slide over bars and up rivers. Their symmetry let them reverse without turning. Their light hulls let crews drag them if the water died. This helps explain why men could risk inlets that larger ships feared. It also explains why a missed tide could strand the bravest crew in a place that turned deadly by noon. With that frame in place, we can pick a typical day. We do not need a famous name to explain the system. We need a clean shoreline with a creek mouth, a village or small religious site near the bank, and a navigable bar at the entrance. And so, this is a teaching day, not a theatrical one. The point is not suspense, but sequence. Each hour unlocks the next because choices are chained to the clock and the coast. Even the word, to go a Viking, hints that we are describing an action, not a permanent class of person. It is a thing done for a span of time that helps explain a paradox at the heart of this topic. Raids that look chaotic in a chronicle were, inside the crew, logistics-heavy operations. Farmers and traders ran them because the same skills, counting time, securing loads, protecting tools, and dividing gains, translated to the water. The fighting mattered, but it served the schedule, not the other way around. Command followed property and respect. A ship had an owner or a leader who could gather men and kit. That leader's first job on a raid day was not to craft a speech. It was to match the crew and the boat to a shore and a timetable. What mattered here was alignment. If the plan asked the oarsmen for speed, the wind could not give, or asked the fighters ashore to move weight, the beach could not bear. The whole line snapped. That quiet pressure sits under every bold verse a skald ever sang. One more word on bias, because it shapes what we think we know. A monk who hears feet at night and watches a door splinter is going to write that down. He is not going to describe the sound of a boat hull sliding back into a channel at a falling tide. The literature of Scandinavia adds those missing mechanics. The older Edda gives us how people saw the world. The skalds give us what was claimed at the time. Saxo and the sagas wrap those claims in stories that had their own needs. When we pick through this, we are not asking which source wins. We are asking what each one is built to show. Now, back to the mouth of the creek. The approach starts before dawn, because early light hides distance and opens options. A watcher on a roof will miss a low hull in gray water, but he will not miss it if the sun lifts behind its sail. The men at the oars row because wind at that hour is a coin toss. Oars do not betray you while you cross a bar. This helps explain why crews took shape as mixed groups of fighters and rowers, not separate specialists. The oar is part of the weapon set. The decisive part of the raid is already underway even before a bow touches sand. The crew is measuring the fall and rise of water against the distance to targets and back to their V. This is not abstract. A chapel might stand 1,000 paces from the bank. A chest might weigh more wet than dry. 2 chests might ask for a second lift. Multiply that by time, and you get the real plan. The important point is not just what to hit, but what to leave behind without breaking the exit. We will walk through that rhythm in the next parts. Scouting, landing, first contact, movement, and retreat. For now we sit with the foundations. Viking means a person shaped by bays and creeks. The best near-contemporary voices we have are the skalds who praised actions that had to align with water and time. The broader stories help, but we will treat them as frames, not proof. And the life behind all of this is not unbroken war. It is a society that farmed, traded, hunted, and at times gathered crews for seaborne work. That is why Europe's coastlines changed. Communities learned to read their own rivers as risks. They built farther from boat landings, raised beacons on headlands, and invested in watching the water as much as the road. Those changes were reactions to a system, not to a single act of terror. You can see the proof in place names around creek mouths and in the pattern of small defenses near fords. The raids taught a lesson. If your wealth can move by small waters, so can your enemies. One more piece settles our expectations for the hours ahead. Speed was not just a virtue, it was a budget. Every minute spent arguing ashore was a minute stolen from the falling tide. That detail explains why many raids did not look like sieges. The aim was hard targets that yielded fast or fled, and soft targets that could be stripped without lingering. In other words, the crew sought decisions that matched the window the Vik allowed. So the boat goes toward the creek. The men rest their feet on sea chests that double as benches. The leader watches the rim of water at the bar for a hint of white. The sounder tests depth with a pole. None of that is dramatic in itself, but each step carries a reason. The pole tells you if your keel can clear the bar now and again in 2 hours. The bench tells you how much weight sits above the rib of the ship. The leader's eyes tell you if the plan can survive the next change in wind. If this feels like logistics wrapped around a blade, that is the point. Fighting becomes decisive only when it protects the route back. A crew that cannot leave cannot win. This is the piece that legends often hide. It is also the piece that gives the word Viking its edge. To haunt a bay is to know exactly when to vanish from it. In the next part, we will step into the approach phase with care. We will look at how a crew scouts from the water, how they rid a coast for warning systems, and how they set a time for the landing that matches the turn of the tide. We will keep our eye on the schedule, the map, and the chain of decisions that holds the day together. The dawn has broken. The Vik is in sight. The clock is already ticking. Before anything touched shore, a raid began with a coastline turned into a set of choices. The longship hovered just outside the contour where surf flattened, and the men watched the edges of land. What mattered here was not courage, but reading that edge correctly. Geography, light, wind, and tide were the real opening moves. Bays, creeks, and river mouths were not just places on a map. They were tools. A shallow, sheltered entry cut through sandbars and backed by headlands gave cover and options. This worked because a longship's shallow draft let it pass where heavier keel vessels could not, and a headland could hide both sail and oars from sight until the last minutes. A vik, the Old Norse word behind the name Viking, meant a small bay or inlet. That term tells us something important. These crews were not randomly appearing from the open sea. They were threading into the small folds of the coast, where cover and exit routes were one decision. In other words, they built their day around geography that forgave quick risks and punished hesitation. Scouting began long before the bow faced a beach. Seasonal knowledge set the calendar. Summer brought long light and calmer seas, but also more local traffic and faster warnings ashore. Late spring or early autumn might give thicker dawns and quieter harbors. The important point is not just weather, but the way light and daily tides created workable windows. These northern sailors did not carry modern charts, but they had something else: memory maps. Farmers and traders who became raiders had sailed these coasts for markets and visits, and they filed away landmarks and channels. This helps explain why the same region saw repeated strikes. A place already known for safe entry and portable wealth made a better bet than an unknown creek. Even without prior memory, the coast could be read. Creeks with sandbars advertised their channels if you knew what to watch. A line of smoother water through a rougher break marked a deeper cut. The color changed where mudflats met gravel. That detail reveals how seamanship became strategy. The person who spotted the channel first was not just a good sailor. They were deciding whether the day would end back at sea. Testing a channel was careful, quiet work. Sails came down well offshore. not just for silence but to keep canvas from slapping and flagging a silhouette against the sky. Oars took over in a low, steady rhythm, because endurance mattered more than a sprint at this stage. In practice, the steersman called time, and the bowmen watched the waters face like a road. Many crews used a sounding pole or a weighted line to feel the bottom. We cannot point to a single manual of Viking seamanship, but northern mariners generally learned depth by touch and count. A pole told you texture as well as depth. Sand that firmed under the tip suggested a walkable bar. Silty mud signaled a sticky trap. That small difference could shape the landing plan in minutes. Listening was part of scouting too. Surf on a bar makes a flat, constant noise. A channel breaks the pattern. Gulls feed where current lifts small fish, and that current often ran along the best entry. This helps explain why many approaches happened in the half-light. Low light hides the ship, but you can still hear the water and read the patterns without glare. A bigger threat than a bad bar was an early alarm. Coastal communities learned to signal with beacons and bells. Raiders planned around those systems rather than hoping they were asleep. The tactic was simple. Use the curve of the coast to stay masked until the last safe minute, then slip in close to land, where line of sight broke down. From the outside, this can seem like bravado. In practice, it was risk control. Target choice followed a logic of weight and time. They wanted portable wealth, silver, church plate, tools, cloth, people, gathered in one place and guarded lightly. That often meant a monastery, a riverside estate, or a market settlement. The trade-off was distance. More distance inland meant more potential wealth, but it also lengthened the return path while news spread ahead of them. Speed and surprise competed, and the coastline decided the tie. A fast open water approach might be visible for miles, but it cut the clock before people could react. A slow, masked entry through a headland could deliver near-total surprise at the expense of a few more minutes under oar. What mattered was consistency. Crews rehearsed one rhythm and stuck to it under stress. Within the ship, discipline served stealth. Shields, usually hung along the gunwales, could flash like beacons of their own. On a silent approach, they were often laid flat, both to cut reflection and to avoid the clatter that traveled across water. Weapons were within reach, but the fighting kit of most men was simple and quiet. An axe, a spear, and a sea axe, the short knife, because extra metal meant noise and fatigue. The battle axe, so often associated with these raiders, makes sense in this phase. It was easy to carry, quick to swing once ashore, and deadly in close spaces. The axe did not decide a landing, but it shaped what a man could do in the first seconds on the beach. That detail would shape the next decision, whether to push inland a few lengths or hold the strand to pull more ships through. Command structure kept the silence organized. A hersir, a local chieftain in Norse terms, often led a ship or a small group. Larger flotillas might follow a jarl, the greater noble. The categories reminded everyone who decided when to risk a bar. In practice, though, the bowman and the helmsman were the eyes and hands of the decision. Signals were set in advance so a single raised fist or a horn note could shift a line. Why horns if silence mattered? Used once at the right moment, a horn cut the confusion of surf and shouting. Crews established short codes, one long for hold, two short for pull, or a banner tilt for follow the leader. This was not elaborate semaphore. It was farm day clarity brought to sea. Clear, simple, repeatable commands reduced the chance of a ship wandering toward a shoal at the worst moment. Tide and light planning were the beating heart of the day. Many bars are safest near high water. If you arrived just before the top of the tide, you could ride the flood in, land with enough light to move, then turn, and take the first of the ebb flowing back out. That pattern worked because the tide itself became your engine. The important point is not just high tide good, but tide plus schedule equals survival. Sometimes the window flipped. In a narrow estuary with a strong tide, slack water, the brief pause between flood and ebb let the ships slip in with less lateral pull. That gave more control for a precise beaching, especially with multiple boats. The next step depended on that earlier choice, because the time available ashore was locked to the next turn of the water. Wind added a second layer. A square sail was quick to hoist but loud and visible. For approach, it stayed furled unless a following breeze could push the ship without flogging the cloth. For departure, everyone hoped for wind with the exit channel, because it spared the crew after hard rowing and lifting. The plan, though, never assumed a friendly wind. Oars were the baseline, deception borrowed from the coastline's shape. One or two ships might show themselves near a larger harbor or river mouth, luring attention and perhaps a small militia. Meanwhile, the main body slipped into a side creek hidden by a spit of sand. This worked because headlands break sightlines, and the low hull of a longship hugs the horizon. A lookout on one promontory could miss movement tucked behind another. Dispersion was another form of safety. Rather than jam every hull into a narrow entry at once, commanders staggered ships by a few lengths. That way, if the lead boat grounded, the following crew had room to back water or swing wide. It sounds like a small detail. It is not. A tangle at the bar could pin half a force in the channel, with oars crossing and keels grinding, all within earshot of the shore. A backup landing site was often chosen during the approach. If the main channel failed a quick probe, too much breaking water, or a new sand tongue, the alternate was prearranged a short pull away. The agreed rule was simple. Do not improvise under the gunwales of a grounding ship. Fall back to the second line, because a clean landing later beats a noisy mess now. Crews also fixed a rally point seaward. If things broke down, a beacon flared early. An armed party appeared on the strand. A sudden squall. Every ship knew where to steer the first safe breath. A specific rock formation or a bearing from a headland served as the reference. This helps explain why many raids looked disciplined even when aborted. They were designed to fail safely as well as succeed quickly. An abort threshold was more than a feeling. Leaders used a few checks, too much time lost on the bar, a crosswind gusting above rowing strength, locals moving cattle hastily inland, or a boat taking damage. Past the line, and the plan shifted from landing to slipping away before the coast could organize. What mattered here was ego control. The best raiders obeyed their own rules. Observation of the shore built a quick picture before commitment. Smoke from cook fires told you the settlement's scale and wakefulness. If bells sounded in odd patterns or repeatedly, that suggested alarm. Cattle and geese, the living alarms of farmsteads, clumped and moved when disturbed. From the outside, this can seem like guesswork. In practice, it was a routine way of reading whether the first minutes ashore would be contested. Regional differences sharpened these choices. In the North Sea and Atlantic, tides had wide ranges and strong streams, so tide timing mattered deeply. In the Baltic, tidal range was small, and winds set water levels more. That changed the clock. Baltic approaches could lean more on wind shifts and less on a narrow high water window. The system adapted, but the core idea, plan the water first, stayed. Inside each ship, roles fixed the approach. The steersman kept the prow aligned with the channel's seam. The bowman called depth and hazards. Midship oars set the pace, and outer oars adjusted for small slips. A small anchor, rigged on a line, could be tossed to bite and pivot the hull if current grabbed it. That anchor was not for staying put. It was a lever in moving water. Risk management even extended to footwear. Men who would jump into knee-deep water to haul the boat wore shoes they could run in wet. That detail shows the blend of farm pragmatism and raiding craft. Everything favored the first 3 minutes ashore, because delays there multiplied into louder, longer movements inland. Knowledge did not come only from the horizon. Trading ties and previous visits fed intelligence. A ship that had delivered furs or fish to a market weeks before learned where warehouses stood, where a monastery kept its plate, and whether a local lord was away. This was not aspiring. It was the ordinary memory of people who moved goods and listened at tables. Market days and feast days concentrated valuables. A monastery on a saint's day drew gifts, and a port on market morning filled with portable stock. From a raider's view, that condensed effort. One quick strike could scoop much more than a thin day. The contradiction is striking. A raid that seemed chaotic to its victims often rode the rhythms of ordinary life. The oar cadence on approach might seem like a small matter, but it reveals how they treated endurance. A steady, quieter stroke conserved legs for the sprint ashore, and arms for lifting loads back. Rowers were farmers first, trained by fields and nets, not by drill yards. The command structure recognized that. Leaders managed fatigue like they managed tide. The coastline itself aided deception just by being uneven. A small knuckle of rock could hide a half-dozen boats until you were almost on the beach. Fog helped, but fog also hid bars. The best gift was a gray dawn, bright enough to see sand ripples, but dim enough to keep a hull and masthead dark. That balance is why the day often started hours before sunrise. In many inlets, waves folded into long, low lines as they approached shallows. The bowmen read those lines and picked the gap. If a breaker stood ahead, the call was to back water and shift a length left or right. The important point is not just detection, but the culture of obeying the call instantly. Hesitation turned one breaker into a cascade of pounding hulls. Weapons stayed quiet. Sword hilts could be metal inlaid and beautiful, but they were rarely clanked on the approach. The tool you touched most was the oar or the boat hook. That contrast tells us something important about Viking identity. Next to warfare and trade, farming shaped them. On the day of a raid, the muscle memory of moving boats and hauling nets was the craft that put them on the strand. Choosing a creek over a river reflected the exit plan as much as the entry. A small creek with a short reach inland offered a narrow window to take goods and withdraw before a levy could ride down from the countryside. A river let you aim at a larger center, but it also created a funnel that could close behind you with even a few boats anchored across. The safe choice favored creeks and coves. Numbers stayed masked until the last safe minute. In a narrow channel, ships lined up. From shore you might see one, maybe two. The rest rode the bend. This helps explain why some early reports underestimated raiders. They measured the first bows rising over the bar and discovered the rest only when men strode up the beach in quick succession. On some coasts, eelgrass and kelp marked the margin of safe water. A raft of weed curling back on itself suggested an eddy and deeper hole. Clean sand with rippling lines suggested a bar crest. Mariners read those textures the way a plowman reads soil. That is not romance. It is how you pulled a loaded boat home without breaking your back. Sometimes the scouting took place the evening before, with ships lying off under a headland, counting heartbeats to dark. A single silent probe could slip in, tap the bottom with a pole, and drift back on the tide. That kind of patience contradicts the popular picture of restless raiders. Yet it served the same purpose: compress risk into the hours that mattered. An often missed factor was current direction relative to wind. A following wind with an opposing ebb created steep, short chop over a bar that made a low freeboard longship wet and loud. A better window might be a rising tide with little wind, trading time for a safer, quieter ride-in. What mattered was picking the smoother state for entry, and saving any rougher water for the exit sprint. Onshore, human patterns left signs even before first light. Paths leading to the beach showed recent prints, if the tide had not washed them. A cleared landing spot for fishing boats hinted at a place where locals expected hulls to come and go without trouble. Fighters looked for those places too. They were the lowest effort doors through the coastline, Finally, the plan had a clock inside a clock. The tide turned on its own schedule, but the inland response had a predictable curve too. A few minutes for confusion, a few more for messengers to fan out, then a longer interval while people gathered more widely. The early minutes paid the most. The first choice of Vik, channel, and approach either gave those minutes as a gift or handed them away. By the time the bow kissed the sand, the shape of the day was set. The ship's entry line created the direction of the first run, the backup plan set the safety net, and the tide marked the deadline everyone would feel in their bones. That is why we begin here, with the quiet math of coastlines and light. The next move was the landing itself. They reached the last 100 yards with oars still, blades feathered close to the water. That silence was not drama. It was control. By shipping the oars early and gliding on the final momentum, the crew reduced splash and sound that could carry inland. It also set up the final step, when bodies not timber would lighten the ship for the beach. A coxswain's voice cut low along the thwarts, and men moved on the benches without clatter. In practice, the steersman held the long steering oar fixed, while a bowhand watched the sand line. What mattered here was draft. A longship sat shallow already, but weight still meant inches, and inches meant whether the keel stopped short or kissed the beach. At the call, half the crew went over the gunwale into wastewater. That detail seems odd until you think hydrodynamics. By stepping into the shallows, the men took their weight off the hull, and the ship rose a little higher. A lighter ship slides those last yards on a rising ripple instead of grinding to a halt. They did this because the window for speed was narrow. The sooner the prow touched sand, the sooner a boarding plank or simple rope could drop, and the sooner iron and shields could cross the line that mattered most, from the water's edge to firm ground. The point was not only to land fast, but to land in a way that set up the next minute cleanly. A stern anchor dropped as the keel kissed sand. That move seems backward at first. You might expect a bow anchor, but a stern anchor let them pivot and pull off later without turning in a cramped creek. With the warp rope led forward, a handful of men could heave the ship back into deeper water at short notice. This helps explain why their retreats looked effortless when they worked. On a wide strand, the bow took the shock, and the oar crew lifted the prow farther with shoulders. In narrow creeks, speed meant even more. A grounded ship was a trap. So the stern anchor was insurance against a falling tide, a gust pushing the bow harder ashore, or the first sight of dust inland signaling riders on the way. The moment the stem thunked to sand, the first men off were shield carriers. They were not chosen for heroics. They were there because a wall of wood buys thinking time. Round shields of planked wood, with a heavy iron boss at the center, came down first. The boss was not decoration. It protected the hand and turned a blow aside instead of taking it dead on, a shore that mattered even more. The first job was not to fight into a line, but to build a breathing space. With shields interlocked at the edges, those first men presented a hard front against any startled farmhand, watchman, or would-be hero who ran toward the beach with a spear. The interlock was simple, not ceremonial. It was two boards overlapped to fill a gap that a javelin could exploit. Behind them came spears and axemen. This order was practical. Spears gave reach to discourage a rush. Axes could split a shield if needed. The heavy, broader-bladed battle-axe that sources call most characteristic of Viking arms was not a tool hammered into service. It was purpose-built to shear through wood and bone, carried by men who could swing it with timing, not just force. Swords followed close in the hands of those who had them. The common profile is worth understanding. These were two edged blades, with a shallow depression running along the middle called a fuller, often called a blood channel in older writing. The fuller was not mystical. It lightened and stiffened the blade, giving it better handling without losing strength. Above the blade was a narrow tang bounded, in period descriptions by the hilts. Round the tang and between those hilt pieces sat the handle, a core of wood, horn, or similar material. Many were covered with leather, sometimes with metal. Above the upper hilt was a knob, a pommel, which balanced the sword for a steady blow. That knob, and often the crosspiece and fittings, could be inlaid with silver, bronze, or copper work. That detail tells us something important. A sword was both a weapon and a sign of means. In practice, however, most men did not carry swords. Spears and shields were more common, because they were cheaper and flexible. A spear could be thrown to cause confusion, or held to form a prickly line. A shield could save your life in the first minute ashore. Armor followed the same logic. Helmets and corselets, made from iron rings, from hardened leather, or thick layered cloth, belonged to wealthier men, or those who had served long enough to collect them. This helps explain the shape of the first fight. It was not a wall of iron from the sea, grinding forward in slow motion. It was a sprint under cover to set a perimeter and choke the local response. A small crew could seem large if it blocked the paths that mattered and forced defenders to come piecemeal into a defended pocket. The first sprint was never random. Hand-picked pairs peeled off to the flanks, not to chase, but to stop messages. Coastal farms and churches were tied into informal alarm chains, by horn, by runner, or by sight from a hill. A man who slips past in the first minute can turn a raid into a running fight an hour later. That is why two fast men with a spear and shield often mattered more than one heavy fighter in the center. That perimeter worked less like a ring and more like a net. One pair might hold a path at a gate or a break in the dike. Another pair could head straight to the small boat beached along the creek and drag it above the high line, or punch holes in its planking. Disabling a pursuer's craft was mobility warfare at its simplest. It made the return to the ship safer by taking away the enemy's river road. Inside that net, the main body chose shape by space. On a wide, clear beach, a line 3 shields deep could roll forward steadily, keeping men together and discouraging a sudden countercharge. In a narrow alley between dunes or a fenced yard, a wedge was better. The point broke a clump, and the sides pushed through the gap. The important point is not the geometry, but the goal. Cross the unstable first 100 yards as a unit. Noise played its role carefully. Shouting in the first seconds had one job: freeze civilians and make them drop what they were holding. Horn calls were for signals, not show. The same is true of fire. A thatched torch on a far-out building could cause panic and flush people into predictable paths. But smoke also climbed like a flag. In practice, raiders used flame when it masked movement or forced keys into the open, not as a default opener. Where missile weapons appeared in these first moments, they were usually short-thrown spears or a few arrows loosed from the ship or beach. Chronicles of set battles describe long arrow exchanges, even pole arms and crossbows in later eras, but a raiding beachhead did not wait for that. Time spent volleying was time for a horseman to crest the next rise. The first shock aimed to end decisions fast. Command inside this storm stayed simple by design. The ship's leader pointed and named the first objectives. Gate, bell, boat, horses, and sub-leaders took small groups to each task. This helped keep the formation from dissolving into a chase. It also kept load discipline alive. In other words, from the very start, the fight bent to logistics. A raider weighed what he could carry, even as he watched a doorway. Equipment weight-shaped choices. A mailed man with helmet and shield could anchor a corner, but he tired faster in a sprint and heat. A lighter man with a spear could run farther to turn a messenger. This is why simplicity worked. Most work was done with wood, iron, and leather that could take rain, salt, and mud, and still function. Fancy fittings on a sword were real, but they did not drive the plan. On the sand itself, the ship crew that stayed back did not idle. 2 or 3 men watched the anchors and the line to the stern. Others flipped shields face down to use as quick sleds for heavy bundles later. That detail sounds almost funny until you picture it. A loaded chest drags over sand easily on a curved board. This helps explain how valuables moved faster than a man could carry them at a dead run. Even the way they held shields changed ashore. In the boat, a shield might be slung. On land in the first shock, grips mattered. A fist around the handle behind the boss gave better control. The boss could then be used like a small battering tool to shove a man aside without committing the blade. That small choice kept the front moving without getting stuck in duels. Axes, when they came into play, targeted structure as much as people. A bar across a door, a lock on a chest, the edge of a shield. An axe bit all three. The broad blade gave a clean bite and made it more than a weapon of show. In a world of wood, iron-edged woodcutters had direct use. That is another reason they appear so often in later memory. They solved practical problems quickly. Swords, by contrast, did their best work when space allowed a clear swing or a controlled thrust. The fuller made the swing lighter, the knob balanced the hand, and the crossguard saved fingers when things got close. The presence of inlay on some pieces did not mean softness. It meant the owner had status, perhaps following a leader who had gifts to give. In practice, swordsmanship was a matter of timing in crowded yards, not fencing display. The first defenders who arrived were rarely professional soldiers. They were farmhands, a steward, a monk brave enough to pull a bell rope, a small household of retainers. That context shaped the fight. A steady shield front and a few spears could overawe a rush of individuals. The wedge then moved through the gap they made as people hesitated. What mattered was to avoid being fixed by courage gathering into a group. If riders appeared early, the perimeter tightened and shifted. A pair on a path became four. The main line might step back 20 paces to pull the fight closer to the beach. That was not a retreat as such, but a redrawing of the line to keep the ship in play as an escape route. Because the stern anchor was already set, the idea of leaving was never theoretical. Every choice ashore bent back to the rope and the tide. Horses cut both ways. If animals were in a nearby pasture, one task group would try to seize a few and bring them within a small corral line, anchored by shields. That was future mobility for the inland push. But loose horses could also mean a mounted messenger vanishing inland faster than any man could run. So one priority in these first minutes was simply to gate and tie. Again, this was logistics disguised as aggression. Tools and weapons blurred. A spear butt tamped open a latch. A shield edge wedged a door. A small hand axe broke through a bar without making as much smoke as a torch. Smoke was used like a scalpel, not a flood. A small fire might make a yard unusable for defenders by driving them around a different corner. But a full blaze too soon warned every hill watcher that a raid was underway. In some regions, the first shock included disabling church bells. A thrown stone or a spear shaft pushed into the bell's yoke could jam it. That sounds trivial, but bells were communication. Cutting one took a voice away from the defenders. The same principle applied to ferries. If a ferry line crossed a creek, raiders might cut the rope and let the platform drift or seize the boat and pull it to their side. All of this happened under constraint. The leader kept one eye on the sun angle and the other on the wind. A wind shift could put waves on the beach that made launching harder. A receding tide could leave the ship stuck. The stern anchor was the insurance policy, but policy only works when premiums are paid. That meant clearing sand from under the keel if needed and keeping hands free for the heave later. From the outside, this can seem like a blur of violence. In practice, it was a checklist under pressure. Shield wall established. Paths sealed. Local boats disabled. Horses corralled or driven off. Bell jammed. First doors opened. And always the anchor line tight and ready. This helps explain why some raids feel similar in the sources. Efficiency leaves a consistent pattern when it works. Not every landing went cleanly. A stone ridge under the sand could stop a prow faster than expected. A hidden post could punch a plank. This is why crews carried simple repair kits, and why some men stayed with the ship even in the first rush. A split board might be wedged and packed with fiber on the spot to hold water out for a few hours. That was enough. The retreat later would be fast. Face protection varied. Many men wore nothing beyond a cap. Some wore helmets of iron with simple nasal guards. Corselets of iron rings, mail, were rare in average crews but present around leaders. Thick layered cloth could blunt a cut and was lighter when soaked than leather. These details reveal a trade-off. Protection helped in a duel. Weight hurt in a sprint. The first shock rewarded those who bet on speed and line discipline. A few arrows could come back their way. Hunters lived in these communities, and bows were tools as well as weapons. The shield front earned its keep when that happened. An arrow into a shield makes a sharp noise and rattles hands. But it also tells you where to look next. The important point is not that missiles were absent, but that they were not allowed to set the tempo in this phase. On cramped beaches, 2 ships could land staggered, one slightly upriver, one on the sand. That spacing prevented crowding and gave 2 anchor lines in case one fouled. It also created a natural crossfire of watches. Each ship's backguard could see the other's flank. Logistics again masqueraded as tactics, and together they made the first contact safer. Even in aggression, restraint had a role. Killing every living thing wasted time and built determination inland. Shock and speed, not slaughter, were the tools that opened locks and scattered will. The fighting was real, but it was a means to an end. Gain control of movement. Seize what could be moved, and leave before the local pattern turned against you. Swords entered fewer lives than spears, but they entered memory more. The inlay, the knob, the leather overhorn. These were details people remembered. That is why sources linger on them. An iron boss on a shield does not draw a poet's eye, but it saved more men than a strip of silver on a pommel. Understanding that gap helps us read the record without getting lost in the shine. One more small correction to movie images belongs here. The thrown axe was not the core tactic. A man who threw his axe lost his tool for the door, his answer to a shield, and his main close weapon. Spears, lighter and meant for dual use, were the things you might send early to break a line. That division of labor is why spears outnumbered swords and axes aboard. If surprise defenders tried to pull small boats into the water to cut off the retreat by sea, raiders shifted fast. 2 men with shields would wade out and tip the boat. Another would split a plank near the keel. A small hole below the waterline is not dramatic, but it ends a chase. That choice bought minutes, and minutes multiplied options under the same tide. By the time the first shock settled, the perimeter stood, the anchor held, and the inland doors were open. The fight had felt urgent, but it was organized urgency. Everything had been sized against the clock set by wind and current. That is the quiet fact beneath the clash. When landfall worked, it was because the ship never left their mind, even while their feet were firmly on the sand. There is a last habit worth noting before we step inland. Crews often staged loot briefly near the water under guard, not carried straight aboard immediately. That looks like a risk, but it was a flow choice. But piling valuables by the outbound path let the ship load in a rush once they decided to go. It also meant fighters stayed light and fast while they still needed to move. The first shock, in other words, was less about heroic stand-ups, and more about flipping a coastline from defender's ground to raider system. Once the paths were blocked and the beach belonged to the ship, the day could pivot to its middle phase. But the stern anchor held the hinge of the whole plan. The rope to the sea was the quiet command thread knotted through every choice ashore. With the beach secured and the first confusion still spreading, the inland sprint could begin. Crews pushed toward the targets they had chosen an hour before: a storehouse, a church with its silver and keys, a manor with food, horses, and taken hostages. The same logic that had shaped the landing now shaped the routes. Shorter paths were better than bigger prizes if they kept the schedule intact. Before that sprint, a final glance checked wind on the water and the slack in the anchor warp. That detail would shape the last decision of the day. For now, the first shock had done its work. It had bought time, space, and a margin of safety that could be converted into goods and leverage inland, and if needed, it could be reconverted back into speed toward the waiting ship without a stumble. The first doors are open, the beach is held, and for a few tight minutes it feels like the loud part of the day. But this is the pivot. Once shock has done its work, the most valuable person on the field is not the boldest fighter. It is the leader who can turn motion into method, because method turns minutes into survival. In practice, a ship's commander usually delegated on land the same way he did at sea. He had one or two lieutenants who knew the plan and could act without asking. The crew split quickly. Assault men held the perimeter. Collectors moved through marked rooms. Handlers built a cache near the beach. And a rear guard watched the tide, the boats, and the landward tracks. That division mattered more than head count, because each role solved a different problem under the same clock. Signals tied this moving puzzle together. A horn call meant a phase change, a hand sign meant a turn or split, and a shouted name meant a person, not a crowd, was needed. Crews also used time marks that were fixed before the raid. A sun height, a tide level on a rock, or a sand stake set by the beach team. What mattered here was predictability. If the inland team lost sight or sound, they still had a moment they were required to meet. The perimeter did not roam. It defined space, choked doorways, and stayed visible to the collectors. That detail reveals a rule that appears again and again in reliable accounts. Surprise is squandered not by enemy bravery, but by friendly drift. The rearguard kept drift from swallowing the schedule, and they did it with quiet authority. From the outside, this can look like fear. In practice, it was discipline. What they took was not random. Portability and value density drove choices more than anything. Coin and silver plate went first, because silver was a universal store of value in the north, counted by weight even when it came stamped as foreign coin. Jewelry and small reliquaries followed, often broken into hack silver on the spot to fit bags and share out later by weight. Cloth mattered more than we assume. High-quality textiles were expensive and compact, and a folded fine cloak could carry the day's worth of milk or meat in value without weighing down a man. Tools with iron also went into sacks when time allowed, because iron was labor to produce and simple to trade. Food was taken only when it fit the march, dense, dry, and ready to carry. Inside a church or storeroom, the collectors worked from a simple script. 2 men opened, 1 assessed, and 1 filled. Assessment here meant asking a portable question. Is this heavier than it's worth? If yes, leave it. If no, bag it. The important point is not just that they knew value, but that they saved seconds by not debating it. The cache near the boat solved 2 conflicting needs. The crew needed the loot to be together and guarded, but they also needed to keep the beach clear for launch, casualties, and last-minute arrivals. So handlers set a central pile behind a shield line, a few strides up from the water, where runners could dump and turn. That detail tells us something important about how the ship commanded the shore. Freelancing was punished by the clock and, often, by rule. Many crews operated under ship laws that sounded like home laws adapted to sea and shore. In Scandinavian legal texts, theft is regulated by escalating fines and marks of silver, and repeat offenders face public ruin. That background helps explain why leaders insisted on common piles, counted shares, and guards from their own circle. Counting mattered because shares were pre-agreed. A ship took a share for maintenance and risk. The leader took an extra share for command and planning. Each man took a share, with a little more for specialists who brought their own gear or skill. This was less about fairness in the modern sense, and more about predictability. When men trusted the split, they obeyed the process that made it possible. The horn that mattered most was not the one that started the rush. It was the one that ended it. Leaders tied the end signal to the tide more than to enemy movement, because the sea did not negotiate. If the high water was narrow, the end call could come minutes after first contact, and that was not cowardice. It was a safeguard against the only enemy that could end a voyage without a fight. Tide and wind set the danger in three directions. An ebbing tide pulled shallow channels thinner, making a loaded boat scrape, stick, and die under enemy arrows. A contrary wind against an ebb could stack short, steep waves into the creek mouth, where a low-sided craft would take water over the bow. Egel's saga tells a grave version. A small boat left late, met an ebb and a southwest gale, and was swamped with all hands. That story is not a raid scene, but it is raid logic. It explains why departure windows ruled the plan. Cargo math lived in the bones of every handler. Longships and smaller coastal craft were forgiving only while they were kept inside their lanes. Weight rode best low and amidships, not too far forward to bury the bow, not too far aft to starve the steering. Trim had to preserve freeboard, the strip of hull above water that kept the sea out. Overload that by greed or panic, and the boat punished you in the first rough patch. A fast loader learned to feel balance through his feet. He kept heavy metal inboard and low, then layered softer goods to cushion and lock it in place. He left clear space for rowers and a path to the bailer, because bailing was not a failure, but a routine. In other words, even the layout of loot carried the logic of movement, not display. Captives changed both speed and options. They were part of value, but also part of risk. In small raids, the most useful captive was a person with connections, an abbot, a steward, or a local merchant, who could send word and pledge ransom. That made sense because money could move faster than a cart. But holding a high-value person forced a choice about time. Some crews tried to negotiate on the spot under a white cloth at the beach. The leader would demand safe passage money or a return of goods in exchange for leaving buildings whole. This worked when locals had coin or silver plate close at hand. It failed when wealth was tied up in land and stock. In practice, most small crews did not linger for haggling. They took people whose ransom could be raised in days, not hours, and sailed. Treatment rules mattered here, and not just for morality. Saga material preserves ideals about not harming non-combatants, or dragging women aboard against their will. We cannot take those lines as universal practice, but we can hear the leadership concern behind them. Abuse created feuds, and feuds closed harbors. Leaders who meant to come back as traders or taxmen had reasons to police their own men. Inside the timeline, the rear guard ran checkpoints. They looked to their watch rock to see the tide against a notch. They waved a turn sign when the inland team needed to cut short a side search. They blew one long blast when the endgame began. This helps explain why big treasure rooms were sometimes left half full, while smaller objects vanished completely. The clock favored small and near. Contingency plans were simple and cruel to comfort. If the inland team missed the last call, the ship waited only as long as the stern anchor allowed in safety. After that, the remaining shore party fell back to the secondary pickup, a creek bend, a spit, or a patch of salt grass marked on the way in. If even that failed, men were taught to scatter, hide, and make for a known headland over days. That sounds harsh, but it prevented the whole crew from drowning together. Handling the beach under pressure looked less like chaos than like a tiny market. Handlers received, sorted, and stacked. 2 guards watched the pile and counted aloud. A third man scribed cuts on a stick, or knotted a cord as a running tally of bags, not because they distrusted their mates, but because memory under stress fails. That small practice prevented accusations later that could split a winter crew. On the ground, the collectors used what they had. Cloaks made good slings. Shield straps made good lashings. Grain sacks turned into coin sacks, and coin sacks turned into ballast. That detail matters because it shows how riding leaned on everyday farm craft. These were not professional soldiers with pack trains. They were farmers and traders solving a carrying problem with what was at hand. Noise discipline did not end with surprise. Horns were used for phase changes, not for celebration. Fires were lit rarely and late. Selective burning was a tool for shaping memory and movement. Burning boats in a small harbor removed pursuit. Burning a hayrick forced locals to think about winter more than chasing. Burning a church risked making a martyr. Think like a trader, and you start to see why not everything burned. The choice to spare or to scorch was often economic. If a place could pay in the future, leaders left a path to payment alive. That meant not turning a market into ash if you planned to anchor there next season with goods to sell and a tax to collect. Terror had a price, and it was paid in closed doors and spears. Restraint had a price, and it was paid in tribute. All the while, the commander moved like a metronome, not a champion. He checked the inland line, scanned the beach, and spoke more with hands than with voice. He watched the tide, the wind across reeds, and the angle of sun on wet planks. That focus tells us what this work really was. It was logistics under a sword, not a sword under logistics. As minutes scraped off the clock, the ship itself came alive. The anchor keepers laid out the line for a clean pull. Oars were run out and seated by weight, heavy rowers paired and balanced across the beam. The helm was tested against the current with a small swing. In other words, they rehearsed departure while the collectors were still on the move. Casualty handling was folded into this rhythm. Wounded men went to the beach early, not last, because loading them first kept space predictable. A dead man's gear was stripped to the common pile by a named friend to avoid quarrels. A quick cairn might be built above the tide line if time allowed. That detail could feel cold, but it was kindness within a system designed to keep the living moving. When the end horn sounded, a practiced countdown began. Handlers threw last bags, the perimeter collapsed inward, and the rearguard faced the land like a door closing. Men boarded by order, not by sprint, because shoving weight forward all at once would swamp the bow. The stern anchor was hauled, the bow angled to the best water, and the first strokes hit together. This helps explain why training mattered more than fury in the final minute. Sometimes the inland team arrived seconds late with a big prize. This is the moment when leadership showed its spine. If the load would compromise freeboard in chop, the object was broken, shared as hack silver, or dropped. That decision ran against pride and against story. But in seawater, pride is heavy. Leaders who survived chose the water. Hostages went aboard early and under watch. They were seated low, not as cruelty but as safety, because panicked movement on a loaded craft kills. A named man stood for their treatment, a kind of living surety to prevent panic or revenge. That arrangement protected value and tested trust inside the crew. In practice, it also set the tone for negotiations at sea or at the next anchorage. Negotiation under time looks odd to modern eyes, but it followed a pattern. A hostage's people would gather at a safe distance, the leader would show a willingness to go, and a quick sum would be named. If a chest came out fast, silver changed hands by weight, not by count. If delay stretched, the crew did not sit and argue with a falling tide. They raised the sail or bent to the oars and made the deal a tomorrow problem. All the choices on the beach flowed from one reality. Rowing against an ebb in a loaded boat is a tax that grows by the minute. Overload and that tax becomes a wall. This is why cargo math and time marks carried more weight than heroics. It also explains the contradiction at the heart of the day. The feared raider spent more minutes sorting, weighing, and trimming than he did swinging a blade, We often imagine a raid as a rolling fight. In practice, the fight was an opening act that created the space for organized work. That work had to fit inside a tide-shaped box. When we say the schedule was decisive, we are pointing to this invisible structure. It took daring to enter the box and craft to leave it full. The share system came back into view at the waterline. Handlers spoke in share language. This bag to the ship, this piece to the common, this tool to the man who carried it. That habit prevented pulling matches over a gilded cup when men needed to be rowing. It also anchored morale to a future payday instead of to present grasping. The important point is that fairness was timed, not abandoned. On the last pull from the beach, the rearguard watched two horizons. Inland, dust and movement meant the local response was gathering. Seaward, tide rips and wind lines meant the water was changing its mind. If trouble came from land, a few spears and a shield wall could buy seconds. If trouble came from water, only freeboard and trim could save the ship. That shaped what they feared and what they fixed first. Selective damage remained on the table until the oars bit. Men who had been assigned to disable local boats finished their cuts and holes. A small shed might be fired to draw eyes and bodies while the ship slid away. But once the first strokes were down, the matchsticks stayed dry. Fire helped on land and hurt at sea, where smoke and attention were enemies of clean water. There is a temptation to see all this as cynicism. It was not. It was a farmer's caution, and a trader's math carried into a violent job. These men lived by seasons and weights when they were home, and by seasons and weights when they were out. The raid brought risk and reward into the same narrow morning, and a leader's job was to keep both from capsizing. When the ship cleared the creek mouth, another set of rules took over, but the day's heart sat behind them on shore. Organization had turned shock into portable value. The clock had cut fantasy into choices, and the boat, trimmed and balanced, carried not just goods and people, but the memory of a morning where command mattered more than legend. The system we just watched is the midpoint contradiction of Viking power. It was built by people who were comfortable counting, not just cutting. That helps explain what followed once a ship met the open water. The next decisions, sail or oar, coast or channel, hide or display, were made by the same measured hands. The story moves from the beach to the tide, and the same clock still ticks. The break does not arrive as a feeling. It arrives as a mark on the tideboard and a gesture from the leader who has been checking the sky more than the loot. That gesture is the most disciplined moment of the day. It means we are done, no matter how many doors remain unopened. What mattered here was not courage but schedule. If the longship leaves late, it surrenders its one true advantage, the ability to vanish into water that horses cannot cross. This hard stop is planned long before anyone steps ashore. Leaders anchor the endgame to daylight and tide, because both control the ship's draft and the channels they can use. In practice, that means setting a retreat window around slack water or the first of the flood, when shoals release their grip and creeks regain depth. It also means the decision to quit is called even if a few men argue for one more chest. The important point is that survival belonged to the crew that left on time, not to the crew that lingered on confidence. This helps explain a detail that appears in Norse storytelling. In the poetic story of the Heijanning fight, warriors battle all day and at night went to their ships. The line is mythic, but the rhythm is real. Raids were structured around a daily return to the boat, because the ship was safety, mobility, and command in one object. Even the Saga's supernatural scenes, swords that leap from sheaths, ravens clawing in the dark, work as echoes of a practical truth. Nights at anchor were dangerous, and people feared what they could not see. Crews planned to be moving with the water before that anxiety set in. Once the signal goes, the inland teams do not sprint randomly toward the beach. They reverse the approach in a controlled sequence designed to keep the line from breaking. The rear guard becomes the front of the problem. Their task is not to win a fight, but to shape space and time so that everyone else can reach the sand. That is why their shields are fresh, and why the men who carried weight earlier trade loads for spears now. Rotation prevents exhaustion from punching holes in a retreat. Rearward control starts with lanes. The same paths opened on the way in are now barricaded behind them. Crews topple carts into alleys, pull fence rails across footways, and leave gates jammed with wedges. None of this is meant to hold forever. It is meant to cost pursuers seconds, then half a minute, and then another obstacle appears. That small rhythm of delay adds up to a cleared gangway on the beach. In other words, obstacles buy breath. Terrain is the second tool. If a track drops into a hollow, the rear guard pauses to let the column compress, then moves when the head rises onto open ground again. This avoids the classic trap of being caught stretched and tired in a low place. If there is a hedge line parallel to the path, they use it as a moving parapet, shifting left or right to keep some cover between them and any bowmen. The important point is that a planned route exists, and the plan privileges defensible lines over direct lines. When contact pressure builds, the formation becomes a moving fence. The shield bearers overlap discs to create a flexible wall, and spearmen set points just beyond that edge. It works because human bodies hesitate a fraction before stepping into that tight, jagged gap. A few short-throw javelins are held for the closest moments, when a staggered foe buys a few yards of quiet. The rear guard's job is not to chase. It is to punish any rush that gets too close, and then reseat the wall. Archers, when present, do not thin ranks from far away like in a medieval tableau. Their role is nearer and more practical, shooting at the ground ahead of pursuers as they bunch up at a gap, or picking out anyone who looks like a local leader, waving people forward. This worked because morale, not just math, decides who crosses open space. A shaken crowd waits. A crowd with a bold neighbor surges. Removing that neighbor is time controlled by other means. Signals keep the thing together. A short horn note might mean compress. 2 notes might mean step back 3 paces. The point is not medieval music. It is usable instructions under noise. Banners and hand signs do the same when close enough. This helps explain why leaders position themselves where they can see the flow, not just the front. They are watching time move through a corridor with moving walls. Casualties are inevitable in a withdrawal. The way a crew handles them exposes both humanity and system. A designated pointman in each team calls triage. Wounded who can walk with a stick are pushed into the column and paired with a carrier to keep them from drifting back. Wounded who cannot walk move to a threshold decision. If the beach is minutes away and the pace steady, 2 men lift with a cloak or shield and carry to the waterline. If pursuit is tight and the column is at risk, the rule turns hard. Save the crew and the ship. That brutal edge was not invented in a vacuum. It grew from the physics of load and speed, and from the ship share system that defined compensation. Shares were paid from the expedition's return, and dead men's shares often passed to their families. This sets a pressure. Do not collapse the mission for one person, but do not abandon lightly what can be saved. The existence of agreed rules spared men from ad hoc blame after the fact. In practice, crews used brief staging spots near the beach as reassessment points. A stretcher delayed by jostle could be shifted to fresh hands, or the decision made to load last after the first push-off. Hostages and high-value prisoners complicate everything. They are more dangerous on a panicked deck than any chest of silver. This is why leaders decide earlier in the day who counts as a negotiable life and who does not. But it is not cold performance, it is risk control. Negotiable hostages go aboard early, under guard near the mast, to prevent a rush of frightened captives from tangling oars or knocking men overboard. Anyone else is either released as a distraction, drifting back into the village as the column peels away, or left tied under watch to be recovered only if time remains. As the beach draws near, the perimeter expands rather than narrows. People imagine a funnel, but the safer pattern is a growing shell that encloses the loading area. Outer teams drop back to the waterline and kneel behind upturned shields, creating a crescent that covers the ship's vulnerable side. That crescent faces land, not sea. The ship is blind on that side when men are hauling, so a living barrier must replace its eyes. Now the ship. Its readiness underwrites the last 5 minutes ashore. Earlier in the morning, a stern anchor was rowed out and set in deeper water with a long rope, or warp, led back through a stern ring. This light kedge is not a luxury. It is the handle that pulls the beached hull into her element. Without it, a dozen men heaving on the gunwale might move nothing if the tide has fallen. With it, a trained crew hauls hand over hand while others push the bow clear, and the ship glides off stern first into the channel. This kedge trick works because of leverage and timing. By setting the anchor ahead of time, the crew trades a slow minute then for a saving minute now. They also avoid swinging broadside to surf or wake, which could roll a half-loaded boat. In practice, the steersman stands at the great side oar, calling the pull and watching the stern to keep it aligned with the deepest water. A man with a sounding pole wades a few steps ahead and calls depth in simple words. Knee, thigh, belly. Those words decide when oars can ship. Loading is a drill of hands, not chaos. Loot is staged in pre-counted bundles near the waterline. Bags of silver, casks of coin, small chests. Heavier goods were either cut into portable fractions earlier, iron broken into tied bars, cloth rolled tight, or they were never taken. That detail reveals the retreat logic inside the day's choices. People often imagine a feast hall stripped bare and cartloads of furniture dragged off. The reality is smaller and faster. Weight kills exits, so crews built the exit into the loot. As bundles move, men count aloud and pass along a chain, so no one wanders into the open with full arms. Shields slide in first to line the rails and give instant cover once aboard. Spears and bows go next. Only then do chests and bags fill the midships. This order matters because a half-loaded boat is least stable and most vulnerable. Arming the rail first lets a few men fight while the rest work. The important point is that roles stay distinct, even when everyone wants to grab and go. The shove-off begins before the last bundle arrives. As soon as weight is enough to bite the keel into the water, the warp tightens, men heave, and the stern slips free. The bow is still kissing sand, but now the ship answers its rope. The last men aboard do not climb midships. They mount at the bow, tossing the final sacks over and sliding on their bellies to avoid capsizing the edge. It looks messy. It is practiced. Then oars. Sail is beautiful but slow to make and unforgiving in tight water. Under pressure, crews go to oars first to get steerage and clear the beach. Once the boat has way and the stern swings into the channel, the steersman calls for the anchor to trip. If it fouls, a small buoy marks the warp for later recovery, but no one lingers to free it. An anchor is cheap compared to a trapped ship. If wind and channel align, the mast goes up only after the ship has a safe margin around her. Wrapping a rectangular sail takes time, and an early set flogs men and cloth, while the hull snakes through shoals. In a headwind, the crew keeps the mast down and rows under the lee of a bank or sandbar, using the smooth water there to hide their speed and reduce strain. This worked because the longship's shallow draft could live where deeper boats, and certainly horses, could not follow. Pursuit sets the next move. When a few small local boats push out, a raiding crew can split its wakes. Two ships swing wide to throw spray and draw attention, while another slips into a side creek that leads to a back channel. The pursuer sees the motion and commits, only to find the water turning shallow under his keel. The longship does not care. It skims, In other words, geography is the weapon. If riders ring the beach, but arrive too late to stop the shove-off, they will try to shadow along the shore and catch the boat at the next ford or promontory. This is where shallow draft turns into survival gear. A leader picks the brown water, not the blue water stained by sand and weed that signals a flat. They row just deep enough to keep the keel clear, inside the line where horses bog and carts fail. This is not romance. It is a reading of color and texture, learned by farmers and fishers who became raiders in certain seasons. Sometimes, the smartest way to avoid capture is to do nothing obvious. The crew might slide into a reed-choked creek and lie still for an hour while the first heat of pursuit surges down the main channel. Silence and a dark hull do more work than extra rowing. This helps explain why many landings and exits happened in marsh country. Marshes are hard on strangers and kind to people who know their seams. What if the schedule slips? The tide turns, the kedge fails to bite, or a load takes too long. This is where raids go wrong. A falling tide can pin a boat on the flat, leaving it exposed to missile fire from the shore. The choice then becomes brutal: dump cargo to lighten, or fight a losing skirmish while the water shrugs away. Crews prepare for this with explicit jettison rules. If the steersman calls a red mark, literally a painted ring on a staff, bundles above a certain weight go back into the sea. Witnesses call the throw so shares can be adjusted later. That small governance reduces the screaming matches that kill minutes. Prolonged delay draws a second danger: organized cavalry. Farmers with spears break at a shield fence. Mounted retainers do not, and they cover distance fast. A crew that aimed for a quick lift can find itself defending a grounded hull with the tide dropping and hoofbeats getting louder. When that happens, a light raid becomes a siege in one move. There are cases in the annals where raiders had to overwinter or bargain for passage because a river barred them and locals built blockades. The lesson is not that they loved to settle. It is that time and water made settlement the lesser disaster. Rear guards do have one last tool against cavalry: geometry. Horses dislike steep, soft entries into water, especially where their footing cannot be seen. If the beach offers such a seam, the shield crescent reforms along that bad ground. Riders balk at charging into what looks like a trap. The few who try are met at the lip with spear points angled up. Even a trained horse will check a step when it sees a hedge of points. That detail buys another minute for the stern to float. The exit logic also shapes the choice to burn. If smoke helps, crews fire damp thatch near the approach lanes, so it smolders and throws a low cloud at rider height. They avoid bright, roaring fires that backlight the ship and blind their own men. This is not theater. It is counter-visibility. A cough and delay at the line of sight are often enough in the last stretch. Everything about the day, in fact, looks different when you hold it up to the physics of leaving. The earlier decision to target a creek mouth instead of a cliff-walled harbor makes sense, because the creek offers more exits. The choice to take coin, rings, and cloth, rather than cauldrons and carved chairs, makes sense because cloth and coin do not slow a shove-off. Even the morning move to disable bells and boats fits this pattern. Bells raise men. Boats carry them. If no one can reach your channel in time, the retreat shrinks from drama to routine. There is a human layer to all of this that the sources sometimes hint at sideways. The burial culture that placed weapons with the dead tells us that gear and identity were bound together. Men who left friends behind did not do so lightly. But the same graves, especially ship burials drawn onto land, tell us something else. The ship itself was a world to these crews. In myth, warriors fought forever, and each night returned to their ships. In practice, crews did the only part of that story that mattered. They returned to their ship because the ship was the only place where the decisions stayed theirs. We can even see how superstition and planning interlaced. Sagas describe strange nights at sea, shields lifted against showers of boiling blood. blades that leapt free. Those images sound fantastical, and they are, yet they translate a feeling cleanly. Nights where men could not read wind or water felt haunted. Leaders therefore built their plans to avoid twilight traps. They wanted oars running before dusk, not after, and a creek to hide in if the wind chopped or the tide misbehaved. In other words, ritual wrapped practical fear. The last 100 heartbeats of the exit are a job for hands and lungs, not for heroics. Haul the warp. Toss the last bag. Count the oars down the port side, then the starboard. When the steersman feels water under the stern, he calls the first hard port or starboard to take the bend that matters. Oars, bite. The prow swings. Men breathe through their mouths to keep from gulping water while they strain. Then the channel opens, the pressure slackens, and someone risks a look back. If the system has held, there is very little to see except people shrinking along a shore they cannot cross. Only then does canvas matter. If wind freshens from a helpful quarter, they hoist, yard up, sheets made, braces set enough to keep the sail clean. Even this has an exit logic. A sail makes you fast, but it also makes you visible. Crews set it when they clear the mouth and not before, because speed matters most when it cannot be answered from shore with a sprint. From there, evasion continues as a water problem. Crews hug shadow water when the sun drops, because glare helps conceal their wake from someone scanning from a headland. They pass a point at slack, not at rip, to keep noise down. They take a channel that dead ends for deep boats, but not for their shallow keel. Each of these decisions grows from the same core. Win the day by deciding where bodies can go, then move where yours can and theirs cannot. The retreat, seen end to end, is less a dash than a checklist. Check the time against the tide. Check the path against cover. Check the loads against the shove-off. Check the wind against your options. This drumbeat turns small crews into forces that keep appearing and disappearing along 1,000 miles of coast. It also shows why the most decisive part of a Viking raid was not the clash in a lane or the shout at a door. It was the practiced craft of disappearing on schedule. And this is where the earlier patterns find their reason. The selection of a low, muddy creek over a shining big harbor. The habit of splitting into teams with clear tasks. The restraint with fire until a screen is needed. Even the quiet anchor rope paid out behind a beached hull. Each looks like a local choice in the moment. Together they are one decision, made all day, to protect the last 5 minutes. The raid does not end when the beach fades. It ends when the crew has put enough water between themselves and a pursuit that could still organize along the next headland. That next stage, choosing offshore versus coast hugging, rowing under lee or setting full sail, and deciding whether to break company or stand together, belongs to open water. The same exit logic will steer those choices too. Only now the wind and the long distances introduce a new kind of math. But for this single day, the math is simple. Leave on time. Keep the wall intact. Load what lets you leave again tomorrow. Use the water the way farmers use the season. Taking what it gives and never asking for more than one crop at a time. In that calm arithmetic lay the raiders' real power. Not in being stronger than their neighbors, but in being able to appear and disappear according to rules they understood better than anyone else watching from the shore. Once the ship clears the creek mouth and the oars fall into an easier rhythm, the work does not end. It changes shape. The raid's final phase begins as a ledger, because what matters next is not speed through water, but trust held together by measured silver. Division of spoils is not a flourish added at home. It is the spine that keeps crews willing to run the same risks again. Predictable shares prevent quarrels that can tear a crew apart, especially when fatigue and fear still hover. In practice, the rules turn danger into a promise. You risk, you obey, you are paid fairly. Most expeditions work from a known scale. An owner's portion for the ship, a commander's agreed share for decision and risk, standard cuts for the steersman, and single shares for ordinary hands. This helps explain why power sat in a paradoxical place. Within an aristocratic world that prized leaders, the line of fighters expected equality inside the bargain. That detail echoes the line attributed to Rollo's men, "We have no lord, we are all equal," which signaled status among warriors, not the absence of leadership. The arithmetic ran on weight. Silver plate taken ashore might be cut down into pieces and weighed as bullion, a system called hack silver by modern historians. Small folding balances and weights traveled with crews, because weighing, not stamping, solved the problem of mixed coins and melted goods. That habit reveals a trader's mindset living inside a raider's day. Predictability had teeth. Oaths and penalties accompanied the scale, because hidden loot broke the machine for everyone else. The important point is not just moral language, but operational need. A crew that distrusts its own division process will not hold when the next retreat turns hard. This is why even legendary warrior codes, like the laws associated with the Jomsborg community, mattered as examples of spirit rather than universal statutes. We should be careful not to imagine a single law across a whole sea. The sources warn against that. Custom varied by region, shipowner, and leader, but the function stayed consistent. Known rules brought cohesion. Sometimes ransoms were a delayed line in the ledger, not counted until paid. Hostages taken for money later were held under separate agreement, often with kin or local elites, acting as guarantors through messengers. From the outside, that can seem like contradiction. Bloodshed and negotiation side by side. But in practice, it was the same logic applied with a longer fuse. There was another reason to keep hostage money separate. A ransom could arrive weeks or months later, and its security depended on a reputation for honoring terms. That detail tells us something important about how violence and commerce touched. A tested word could be as valuable as a strong hull. The day's rhythm continued at sea in quieter decisions. Crews weighed whether to set sail or keep to oars depending on wind direction, fetch, and the risk of showing canvas to lookouts. A low profile along a lee shore might trade speed for anonymity, buying safety with patience. If pursuit remained possible, crews managed light and silhouette. Dark sails or reefed canvas sat lower against the horizon, and distance grew under ordinary rowing. What mattered here was not grand tactics, but countless small choices that shortened the odds of being seen. When the ship reached a friendly haven or a hidden shore, order resumed like a slow exhale. Damaged gear moved first, sail rips stitched, oarlocks reset, cordage checked, and the tarred seams along the hull inspected. This helps explain why raids always lived in the same season as repairs, because maintenance is part of a fence when your ship is your life. Weapons received the same attention, with a farmer's economy folded into a fighter's routine. Swords with inlaid hilts and balanced knobs were prized tools, but the truth on many decks was the axe. The broad-bladed axe cut, levered, and split shields or firewood alike, which is why it so often appears as the weapon that traveled from home to ship and back again. The loot itself changed shape under this maintenance culture. Heavy objects that were awkward to carry might be melted down or clipped to standard weights that matched common transactions. In other words, the voyage did not simply end with treasure. It ended with treasure made usable. Back on land, the shares moved into ordinary life in a way that breaks the popular image of permanent warfare. Many of these men were farmers. The raid sat between sowing and haymaking, or around harvest windows, because food set the calendar for those who planned by both moon and tide. What mattered to most families was not trophies, but stability. Silver patched a roof, purchased a slave or freed a debtor, and filled a gap when a season failed. This helps explain why the same community could send a crew one year and host a market the next. Livelihood was a blend, not a badge. Trading always ran alongside this life. Scandinavians worked in fixed centers, and at seasonal markets where risk and opportunity met. That The line between merchant and raider, as the sources remind us, was thin enough that traders sometimes agreed to a truce while they bartered and then returned to enmity when business concluded. That arrangement sounds strange until we remember the core problem. Trade without security collapses, and raiding without goods is pointless. So men who wore both identities learned to compartmentalize. That detail would shape the wider economy around them. Consider the figure of Ottar, who told King Alfred of his voyages north among the Finns, and into chill waters toward the White Sea. His story, recorded at an English court, reveals the curiosity and enterprise that stood inside the raiding world. In practice, it reminds us that a landed gentleman could trade and explore without any sense of betrayal to his class. At home, the leader who set the raid in motion often returned to an almost ordinary stride. The sources describe an active country gentleman, a landholder whose duties circled from fields to local assemblies. His chief amusement, we're told, was the chase, with hawking held up as a favored sport. One legendary life of St. Edmund places Ragnar Lodbrok in that very picture, driven ashore by a storm and welcomed as a guest. He is said to have met death at the hands of a jealous huntsman who envied his skill as a fowler. We should not take the episode as literal history. We should see what it signals about esteem and rivalry inside elite leisure. The point of that vignette is not its gore, but its frame. Even famous raiders could sit under hospitality rules, move in hunting parties, and compete in the same games that defined status at home. This helps explain why leadership at sea felt familiar to men who led on land. Socially, the structure surrounding all this looked aristocratic, yet inside the warrior band, an ethic of equality had real weight. Command rested on honor and capacity as much as on birth, and the share system protected that bargain. When the question, "Who is your lord?" met the answer, "We are all equal," it expressed an internal code, not a political manifesto. Our best witnesses to this world speak in different registers. Skaldic poems, composed near the time of the events they celebrate, deliver names, victories, and place names, wrapped in dense metaphors. They are praise, not journalism, but their proximity and detail make them valuable when handled with care. Eddaic poems, by contrast, carry worldviews rather than itineraries. God's fate, the place of honor and betrayal. These poems tell us how listeners understood courage and shame. From the outside, this can seem less practical, but in practice, those stories taught habits that men brought aboard. Later sagas, written down centuries afterward, build long narrative arcs from distant memory, family pride, and local lore. Historians use them with caution, extracting social texture and patterns of custom while cross-checking with archaeology and earlier verse. The important point is not to dismiss them, but to weigh them as part of a layered archive. One more set of texts reminds us why it is unwise to flatten this world. The laws or rules preserved around communities like the Jom's Vikings show what a warrior code could look like, but they never govern everyone everywhere. We learn from them how a regimented band might think about discipline without pretending the sea followed one book. As more Scandinavian literature became available to scholars, older certainties shifted. For long stretches, monasteries and courts beyond the north wrote most of what Europe read about raids. Opening skaldic verse and domestic sources changed the angle, putting trade, farming, and custom beside the shock of attack. That revision matters here because it recasts the day we have been following. The episodes of violence do not vanish, but they sit inside a routine that looks almost administrative under pressure. The raid becomes less a blur and more a tightly scheduled craft. Wider ripples followed from repeating days like this along river mouths and islands. Coasts built watchposts and simple alarm systems not as heroic fortresses, but as practical early warning. Communities experimented with payments, truces, and seasonal negotiations, because sometimes that was cheaper than a ruined harvest. Trade routes bent to this new pressure, often threading through safer anchorages and friendlier ports, and relying more on known market times. This was not a single master plan. It was a series of adaptations that made life workable under the new risks. We can see why tribute, later made famous as lump sum payments to buy peace, fits the same operational logic. Tribute converted unpredictable violence into scheduled cost, which an economy can plan around. The raiders, in turn, treated it as one more line on the voyage ledger. None of this should be inflated into romance. People died under those decisions, and fear carried its own cost. But if we are explaining systems, we have to account for the incentives that kept the cycle moving. One day of writing shows in miniature how Scandinavian society could bend without breaking. Farming absorbed wealth and men back into routine. Markets turned part of the loot into tools, debts settled, and ships repaired. Leadership rested on skills that were not mysterious. A man who managed his estate, chaired disputes at a local assembly, and kept clients loyal already practiced the same judgments he would need in a tidal creek. That detail reveals why certain elites could glide between roles. The internal ethic of equality among fighters made sense on a longship where survival depended on rhythm and trust. Predictable shares expressed that ethic as policy. In other words, fairness was not sentiment. It was a survival tool. Meanwhile, the weapons that marked the raid lived double lives. A sword served as status, but the axe did chores and war. That dual use tells us why the boundary between peaceful work and violence felt thinner than we might expect. If there is a single controlling idea tying this together, it is schedule. Tides, daylight, markets and seasons all set windows of possibility. Men who read those windows well turn small crews into forces with effects far beyond their numbers. Even the word Viking gestures toward coast and motion. Many scholars link it to the old word for a bay or creek, or to a term for someone who goes riding by sea. Etymology cannot steer a ship, but it points us toward geography as a teacher. That is the paradox this day leaves behind. The blade mattered, and courage mattered, but the engine underneath was routine. Success depended on arriving, striking, counting, and leaving at the right moments, again and again. What changed Europe was not just the shock of first contact. It was the repetition of these measured days. Every time a crew threaded a creek at dawn and rolled back toward open water on time, they forced neighbors to learn, to pay, to watch, and to reorganize. Memory amplified the fear because it noticed the edges, not the middle. Chronicles preserved the burning and the battles more readily than the careful loading or the quiet negotiation over a hostage. Our job is to fit the edges back into the middle where the logic lives. In that middle, the men who rode also bargained and sewed. Their leaders wore hawks on the wrist and weighed silver on a scale. The world they built on both sides of the gunwale was not consistent, but it was coherent. Seen from this angle, a single day becomes a blueprint. It shows us a system that reached for advantage in coastlines and calendars rather than in constant winter war. That is why opening the northern sources mattered. It refocused our attention from legend to method. By the time the ship pulls into the home inlet and the first shouts travel over the water, the crew already knows the next steps. Gear stored, wounds tended, shares counted, and stories prepared for winter. The cycle folds back into ordinary time. Tomorrow, a leader might ride to a local assembly and settle a boundary dispute. Someone else might mend a net, hatch a trading plan, or train a hawk to stoop cleanly over a field. The raid sits inside that broader life like one urgent chapter, not the whole book. That is the final lesson of the coastal raid. A farmer's mind ran the schedule, a trader's hand weighed the silver, and a fighter's nerve held the line long enough to leave. Violence was an instrument. Routine was the craft. And when we say Viking, we should remember the inlet and the tide as much as the shield and the sword. The shoreline taught the rules, and the rules made small crews large. In the end, the most decisive part of a raid was not the fighting, but the timing that made fighting unnecessary to repeat.